Welcome to week 7 of the Ditch the Grocery Store Challenge. If you're new to this channel or to these challenge videos, welcome here, and I invite you to go watch week 1, which I will link below, and it has more information about me and this challenge. Okay, today we are making pizza completely from scratch. I will be sharing everything from how to make the perfect crust, and I have 4 different recipes for you depending on whether you use fresh milled flour, all-purpose flour, sourdough, or commercial yeast, so you can pick your favorite. And then I'm going to be showing you how to make mozzarella cheese from scratch. It is so easy and quick to whip up and have ready for your pizza. And then I'm going to be showing you how to prep and bake your pizza so that you have no more excuses to get takeout. In fact, I'm then going to share with you how to freeze your pizzas for ultimate convenience. And while I won't be going over the whole process today, I'm also going to be sharing with you another video and recipe for making homemade marinara sauce, which is what we use to top our pizzas. Oh, and I'm also going to share with you another recipe for making skillet pizza, or that's what we call it, and it uses sourdough starter for the crust. It's so quick and easy to make. We eat this a lot in the summer when we're outside in the evenings and we don't want to spend a lot of time in the kitchen, and you might like it so much that you scrap traditional pizza crust altogether. It is that good. Okay, that sounded like a lot, but I promise it's all very easy. Let's get started first with the crust. I'm going to share a few different crust options, and you just need to pick one depending on what you're working with. Let's start with my tried and true all-purpose flour and commercial yeast crust recipe. This one is going to taste the most like store-bought or takeout, and it is so simple. A little side note, I have successfully made this recipe subbing a gluten-free flour mix 1-to-1 for the all-purpose flour, so there is that option too. Okay, simply mix together in a stand mixer 2 cups of warm water, 2 tablespoons of active dry yeast, and 2 tablespoons of honey. Whisk that real quick and then let it sit for about 2 minutes. Next, add in 2 tablespoons of oil and 2 teaspoons of salt. Whisk it again. Then put your dough hook on and add in 5 cups of all-purpose flour. Turn your mixer on low speed and let it knead until the dough has come together and formed a smooth ball. Cover the bowl and let it rise for 1 to 2 hours, depending on how warm your kitchen is and how much time you have to prep dinner. You can do this exact same recipe using whole wheat or fresh milled flour. The only difference is that you need to add a bit more water since the fresh flour is more absorbent, so add 2 1/4 cups of water instead of the 2 cups. Since all wheat and fresh milled flour is a little different and cup measurements aren't exact, make sure that when you get to the step of kneading to make sure that the dough ball is no longer super sticky. You might have to adjust your flour or water amounts until it looks right. Another optional step that I like to do is to mix the water and the flour and the lemon juice together first and then let that sit for 15 minutes so that the flour can absorb the water and the bran can soften a bit before adding in the rest of the ingredients. This is optional, but I have found that it makes a pretty big difference. Okay, so those 2 recipes were for using just regular active dry yeast from the store. The steps of rolling out the dough and baking it are the same no matter which recipe you're using, so I'll save that for last. Also, keep in mind that all of these recipes will be available on the challenge dashboard, so there's no need to memorize this or write it down. The video really just serves to show you what each step should look like. Okay, so if you want to use sourdough instead of commercial yeast, I recommend getting started early in the day because the rise time is a little longer. I also recommend using a scale with sourdough recipes. If working with freshly milled flour, start by adding to either a large bowl or a stand mixer 400 grams of water, or about 1 2/3 cup, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, and 600 grams fresh milled flour, or about 5 cups. I use about 300 grams hard white, 100 grams hard red, and 200 grams kamut, but all hard white will work too. Then mix this together well and let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes. Like I said before, this step is optional, but it really does make a difference. Next, you're going to add in 120 grams, or about a 1/2 cup of active sourdough starter, 1 tablespoon of honey, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and 2 teaspoons of salt. Mix well. I did this today with a dough whisk, but you can use a stand mixer as well. Finally, knead that dough for about 10 minutes. Then cover and set it aside. If you're working with all-purpose flour instead of freshly milled, you can skip the step of letting the flour sit with the water and lemon juice, and you can scratch the lemon juice altogether. And I'm using the terms freshly milled flour and whole wheat flour interchangeably here, even though they are very different things, but for the purpose of these recipes, just treat them the same. Then with both of these sourdough recipes, you have two options. You can knead the dough in a mixer until it passes what is called the window pane test, which I'll explain in a minute, or you can simply go back and do some stretch and folds throughout your day. No need to time this or be super particular about technique. Just every 30 minutes or so, go do some stretch and folds until you're about 2 hours out from when you want to be serving the pizza. And then it's time to move on to the next step. Now, I will say I usually use my mixer to do this, but I was listening to Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone talk about how she thinks that stretch and folds are actually easier. So I tried that today, and while it did work okay with my all-purpose flour dough, it just didn't seem to be enough for my whole wheat flour. Now, what that tells me is that I just didn't do enough stretch and folds. But I did get to the point where I needed it to get past the window pane test so that I could just get on to its final rise. The window pane test is simply done by taking a small ball of the dough. If you can stretch it thin enough to see through it without it just tearing right away, it's good to go. If not, it just means that it needs some more kneading or some more stretch and folds. Once it does pass this test, you can just cover it and let it rise until it doubles in size, which for me took about 2 more hours in my oven with the light on. If your kitchen is warmer than mine, you could probably just leave it on the counter covered. While our pizza dough is rising, let's whip up some homemade mozzarella cheese. There are a few disclaimers I want to put out there before you try this recipe. First, ultra-pasteurized milk doesn't usually work. The proteins are too damaged to form proper curds. You need a low-temperature pasteurized milk or raw milk. Also, a few times I have had my curds get really grainy instead of smooth, and I came to find out that it was the acidity of my milk. It was really high for some reason. This can be caused by the cow's diet or a high bacteria count. Our cow did eventually show signs of mastitis, so I'm wondering if this was the cause for us. Okay, disclaimers aside, this recipe is really simple to make. Add 1 to 4 gallons of milk to a large non-reactive pot. I'm assuming if you're just making this mozzarella for your cheese, 1 gallon is probably enough. For every gallon of milk, dissolve 1.5 teaspoons of citric acid in a half cup of water. Stir to combine. Then evenly add the dissolved citric acid to the milk. Stir the milk in an up and down motion to blend well. Turn the heat to medium-low and slowly heat up the milk to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Stir occasionally. While the milk is heating, prepare the rennet. Your rennet bottle should tell you how much rennet and water per gallon of milk. Mine says a half teaspoon of rennet per gallon of milk, and I dilute this in a half cup of cool water. When the milk comes to temperature, turn off the heat, add the diluted rennet, and stir in an up and down motion until the rennet has been evenly distributed. Cover the pot with a lid and set a timer for 15 minutes. When the timer goes off, remove the lid. The milk should now be set up. Use a large knife, I use a bread knife, to cut a grid pattern into the now hardened curd. Aim for about 1-inch squares, but it definitely doesn't have to be perfect. Then let it sit for another 5 minutes. Towards the end of that 5 minutes, turn your sink water on hot to heat up. After 5 minutes is up, you're going to use a spoon to gently stir the curds and cut the rest of it into 1-inch cubes. Again, don't worry about perfection here. Next, you're going to drain the whey off of the curds. You can set a colander on a pot to save the whey for other things or to give to your chickens. Then fill the pot with that hot water until it covers the curds, gently stirring it with your hands to break the curds apart. Dump the curds back into the colander a second time, and this time you can just let the water go down the sink. Now we're going to add a little salt. Sprinkle 1 teaspoon per gallon of milk over the curds and mix it in. After it is mixed well, ball the curds together as best you can and place the ball back into the pot. Let the pot fill up with hot water again until it covers the curds. Then take that pot back to the stove. Turn the stove back onto low heat. As the water heats up, the curds are going to more easily stick together and form a ball. If you have more than a gallon of milk that you started with, you may want to separate that large ball into 2 smaller ones. Now it's time for the fun part. Start picking up each ball with your hands and letting the cheese stretch down towards the water. Dip the whole ball back in and repeat the process, this time grabbing another part of the ball. This is not an art, so don't stress about technique here. You're simply dipping it in hot water and letting it stretch out. This is going to give you that mozzarella consistency. The water should now be too hot to really leave your hands in. You should be able to dip your hands in and then immediately take them out. If it's too hot, you're going to end up with a strange consistency to your cheese, but you also need it to be warm enough for it to stretch. Taking tongs or whatever kitchen tool that will do the job, a spoon works in a pinch, you're going to pick up the cheese ball and continue letting it stretch in the same way until it stretches easily without breaking and develops a glossy appearance. When you hit that point, you're done. If you want to form it into cheese sticks or use it fresh, it's ready to work with at this point. I like to put it through my salad shooter and shred it, and that's what I'm doing today. All right, let's finish up the pizzas. No matter which of these recipes you chose for the crust, the final steps are all the same. You're going to take your nicely risen crust dough, punch it down, and separate it into 2 even balls. I then like to roll it out almost all the way before I put it onto a piece of parchment paper sprinkled with a little cornmeal. It just rolls out better on the hard surface. This whole wheat crust rolled out so nicely, and the dough was so easy to work with, but you'll notice that I struggled a bit with this all-purpose flour recipe. There are 2 reasons for this. First, I think I did make the dough a little wet. I probably should have added a smidge more flour. It turned out great, but it was a bit of a pain to work with. The other reason was that the gluten wasn't as relaxed. Remember how I threw my whole wheat dough in the mixer for a bit? I didn't with the all-purpose because I thought it felt fine. Well, I think it could have benefited from that extra kneading as well. After I transferred the dough over to my parchment paper, I finished rolling it out so that it is just larger than the size of the pan I'll be baking it on, and then I roll in the edges. Then I take a fork and stab a few holes in the bottom. This just keeps any major bubbles from forming on the bottom of the crust while it's baking. At this point, if you'd like to make super handy frozen pizzas, perfect for when you're coming home right at dinner time, here is all you have to do. Cover the crust and let it rise for 15 to 20 minutes. Bake the crust at 425 for 5 minutes. Then cool the crust completely before adding your toppings. Wrap it really well with plastic wrap, and I like to do another layer of foil just for good measure. I then write on the foil the reheating directions, which is to bake it at 425 for 12 to 15 minutes. If you're cooking your pizza right away though, the next step is to preheat your oven to 475 Fahrenheit while you let your crust do one more rise for about 15 to 20 minutes. You can prep your toppings while you wait, and if you're in a hurry, you can skip the second rise step and you'll hardly notice. Put on your desired toppings. We do different flavor combinations like barbecue sauce and pork and pesto and chicken, but our usual go-to is the standard marinara, mozzarella cheese, and pepperoni, salami, or sausage. We just use the marinara sauce that we can each year from the tomatoes that we grow. I will put this recipe on the challenge dashboard, but for a full video tutorial on how I make the sauce, go check out this video. I'll link it below. Then I sprinkle on the mozzarella. The easiest way I've found to shred a bunch of mozzarella is my handy dandy salad shooter. And then today we had some salami in the fridge, so I just used that, followed by a light sprinkling of more cheese. Then these got baked at 475 for 12 to 15 minutes. I love how no matter which crust recipe you choose, you really can't go wrong with these recipes. They always turn out so good, and with pizza being such a flexible and well-loved dinner, it's easy to serve it frequently and no one ever gets bored of it. I do have one more recipe to share with you today though that is really great when you want to whip up a delicious pizza at the last minute or you don't want to spend much time in the kitchen. This recipe is also great because it utilizes sourdough starter, but there isn't the long proofing time that comes with the traditional crust recipe. We call this skillet pizza, and it is so easy I can hardly call it a recipe. It's more of a technique. To start, preheat your oven to 425 with a cast iron skillet inside. Today I'm doing this smaller one because it's just to go with lunch, but if I was making dinner for our large family, I'd use my big cast iron cooker pan. After the skillet is nice and hot, pull it out, drizzle it with a little olive oil or avocado oil, then pour in some fed sourdough starter. Spread it across the bottom and sides just in a nice even thin layer, and you will notice that as soon as the starter hits the pan, it will start to cook, so move fast. Drizzle it with a little more oil, and then some salt and Italian seasoning, or whatever seasonings go well with your toppings. Then pop it in the oven for about 8 to 10 minutes, or until it is nice and crispy and pulls away from the sides of the pan. Finally, add your toppings. I will say that regular marinara makes the crust a bit soft, so in the summer we use fresh sliced tomatoes along the bottom or pesto. I've also made an Alfredo sauce, but no matter what you decide to top it with, it will be amazing. Today I'm just using marinara, and no one complained. It's always a hit. I can't wait for you to try one or more of these recipes. I'm sure they will become family favorites. Thank you so much for cooking along with me today. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Make sure to join me here next week for week 8 of the Ditch the Grocery Store Challenge, and hopefully you'll join me here on Fridays as well. I share videos each week on homemaking, homesteading, food from scratch, and a little homeschooling too.